I start, Ibu Ida?
Ya, oke, siap.
We have 84 people in the Zoom meeting.
Yeah. Okay, you can start.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat malam Bapak Ibu semua peserta Zoominar kali ini. Terima kasih sudah bergabung di acara kami yang kali ini malam hari karena kita menyesuaikan dengan waktu narasumber kita yang berada di USA yang di sana masih pagi dan kita sudah beranjak malam. Sekali sudah menyempatkan waktu untuk mengikuti acara kita hari ini. Sesaat sebelum webinar dimulai, saya memberikan sedikit opening, kenalkan pusat studi kami di FISIP Unpad. Pusat studi kami bernama Pusat Studi Desentralisasi dan Pembangunan Partisipatif yang bergerak dalam riset-riset area of governance, participatory development, and capacity building. Selama ini kami sudah bermitra dengan beberapa lembaga, baik di instansi pemerintah maupun juga dengan universitas-universitas di luar negeri. Ini adalah beberapa dari partner yang pernah bekerja sama dengan kami. Saat ini kami memiliki beberapa riset, ada 3 riset utama yang sedang berjalan, yaitu Water Insecurity and Gender-Based Violence, ini dipimpin oleh Ibu Bina Hayati Rusyidi dari Ilmu Kesejahteraan Sosial, lalu integrasi pembangunan desa kota dan pengembangan kapasitas pemerintah daerah dalam mengatasi krisis air. Ini adalah riset yang dipimpin oleh Ibu Ida Widyaningsih dari Administrasi Publik, representasi kewargaan dalam kontestasi elektoral, studi tentang diskursus identitas dalam kampanye Pilpres 2019, ini yang dipimpin oleh Ibu Caroline Pascarina dari Ilmu Politik. Hasil-hasil riset yang sudah kami lakukan dipublikasikan di beberapa jurnal internasional dan juga jurnal dalam negeri. Di antaranya adalah ini, dimuat di jurnal International Social Work. Ini adalah grup jurnal berada di bawah stage. Judulnya adalah Incentive-Based Social Welfare Administration in Indonesia, Implications for Sustainable Development in Women's and Children's Protection. Selain ini juga ada beberapa publikasi yang dimuat di jurnal-jurnal lain seperti ini, Indonesian Women in Public Service Leadership, a Rapid Review. Lalu ini adalah yang terbaru dari Ibu Caroline, Divided by Hashtags, Unrepresented Citizenship Findings from 2009 Indonesia Electoral Discourse in Twitter. Lalu juga ada publikasi yang lain di jurnal nasional Effectiveness of Infrastructure Development for Wastewater Service in Decentralized Indonesia, Case of Bandung Municipality. Selain publikasi berupa artikel di beberapa jurnal, riset-riset kami juga dipublikasikan dalam book chapter, salah satunya adalah ini, Pathways to Wellbeing, Low Carbon Challenge to Live Virtuously and Well, Participatory Design and Education on Mitigation, Adaptation, Governance, and Accountability. Dan ini adalah salah satu buku paling baru yang baru saja terbit, ditulis oleh Ibu Caroline dan tim, tentang konstruksi kewargaan dalam perbincangan di Twitter. Selain itu, studi kami juga mengelola jurnal pengabdian kepada masyarakat yang bernama Kumawula. Apabila Bapak Ibu berminat, boleh berkunjung ke web jurnal kami dan juga berpartisipasi mengirimkan artikel. Selain kegiatan riset, kami juga mengadakan kegiatan seminar selama work from home. Dan sejauh ini pas seminar malam ini adalah yang kelima, seminar tentang research method. Ini yang pertama dan kedua yang sudah berlangsung beberapa minggu yang lalu. Ini adalah seminar yang ketiga dan keempat yang baru saja berlalu. Dan ini adalah seminar kita hari ini. Kita memiliki narasumber Profesor Donna Mertens dari Gallaudet University Washington DC di Amerika yang telah berkenan menjadi pemateri untuk kali ini. Thank you Prof. Donna Mertens for being our guest speakers tonight. Dan kami juga memiliki seri-seri riset policy yang lalu sudah kami lakukan adalah ini dengan Profesor Taiwanam, dan kami juga akan mengadakan another policy research seminar itu dalam beberapa minggu ke depan dengan narasumber Profesor Park Hyung Jun dari Sun Kyun Wan University Korea Selatan. Kira-kira begitu perkenalan mengenai pusat studi kami. Terima kasih sudah setia untuk mengikuti webinar mingguan kami dan kami juga berharap Bapak Ibu akan bergabung dalam kegiatan-kegiatan kami selanjutnya. Baik, waktu dan tempat saya operkan kepada Ibu Ida untuk memulai kegiatan webinar kita. Mangga Ibu Ida silakan. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Ibu Erna. So we have Professor Donna Mertens tonight. Thank you very much for being with us, Donna. So it is an honor for us to have you. This is actually the second time for you to be our guest lectures here in Indonesia. Last time you came here in person, however, because of the COVID-19, so we just conducted through online platform. So before we start the lecture, I would like to give a very short introduction about Professor Donna Mertens, PhD. She's the professor of the Gallaudet University, Washington, D.C., USA. Donna Mertens, she published so many books on research method. One of the best-selling research book is actually research and evaluation textbook. And she is also the past president of American Evaluation Association. She's the former editor of the Journal of Mixed Method Research and also professor emeritus from Gallaudet University, Washington, USA. So if you would like to know more about Donna Mertens' publication, you can check her ResearchGate profile. Donna and I also published one paper in Mixed Method Research Journal, and we are now also working on another piece of work that actually our research collaboration. Donna, I think we will start your session for about 30 to 45 minutes. And during the session, actually, Donna will ask you some questions, and please feel free to post some comment on the chat, and then I will read the comment and questions from you to Donna. Donna, please, you can have your time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ida and Erna, for the very kind introductions that you provided and for inviting me to be here today. I very much appreciate all the support that UNPAD has given us so that we can all be joined together. With the restrictions on travel now, it's so important that we get together with the electronics that make it possible for us to communicate. So I am going to begin this presentation. Can you see my screen now? Wait, let's see. Share screen, share screen. All right, I would like to share that screen. All right, there. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Oops, sorry.
There
we go. Okay. All right, so I am very, very happy to reconnect with you and to be a part of this amazing group of people that you have managed to organize around the topics of transformation and research methodology. I will be talking about community engagement specifically and transformative mixed methods. I know that Norma Rahm did a very detailed presentation on mixed methods. And so I'm not going to get into the very basics and the beginning points for mixed methods, but I'm going to talk more about how do you design a mixed methods study so that it can increase the probability of having a transformative effect. And the basis of that argument, the need that is most highly visible there is the need for community engagement, because if we're going to see transformation, we need to see engagement across the full length of the research study. So Ida has already provided you with an introduction, and so I won't go back into many of these things that I have done and who I am, but just to say that as the editor of the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, I was able to see the development of the field from just the beginning point of people saying, I wonder if we can even talk about mixed methods, because we have people who are very much qualitative and people who are very much quantitative. But how do we bring that conversation together so that we can really maximize our impact as researchers through the use of appropriate methodologies that get us to the point where we can understand the context and the complexity of the issues, and then provide data that supports action that's going to be responsive to the needs and create the transformation that we're looking for. Then also, as Professor Emeritus from Gallaudet University, you may be aware that Gallaudet is a university for deaf people, for the people who cannot hear. And so the language there was sign language, and that was American Sign. And I deliberately went to that university because I wanted to see what it would require for me as a member of the majority hearing population to respectfully enter that community and to understand issues from their point of view, and to understand the heterogeneity within that community so that I could be a partner to creating the transformations that were necessary to address the needs of that marginalized population. And from that experience, I realized that the basis of marginalization differs by context, and that hearing status is just one of those variations that's used to exclude people. But sometimes it's the color of the skin, sometimes it's socioeconomic, sometimes it's the region you come from, your religion, your age, the poverty status that you hold. And so these are the things that came to be very real to me as I tried to understand what does it mean to really design research that's going to address the needs of that kind of heterogeneity in order to address the systemic discrimination that keeps people from having the rights that they all deserve to have. And so as I struggled with that, I came up with the concept that bringing a transformative lens to our research was what was needed, because just doing research following the old traditional ways would lead us perhaps to questions that we thought were important, but were they important to the communities that we worked with? Were the methods that we were using for data collection, although we have the concepts of validity and reliability, were those being culturally responsive? Were they methods that would give us data that would really give us insights into what was needed and how effective the interventions are that were being proposed? And so bringing this transformative lens would put us in a better position to contribute to the social transformations. So I noticed that many of the titles of the seminars that you've already held have the word transformation in it. And I know that that is the buzzword now for the Sustainable Development Goals, that we need transformative change. And so I went to IDEAS, the International Development Evaluation Association, to see what they talked about in terms of transformational change, which they acknowledged is needed for our societies, our economies, and our relationships with the environment, which is very important. And I know that the people of West Java, Indonesia, or wherever else you're situated here, the audience, know that this social, economic, and environmental nexus needs to be addressed in order to have sustainable change. And so what they talked about was that on many fronts, the world needs transformational change to be able to reach those aspirations that are in the SDGs, to free the world from poverty, to leave no one behind, to have a prosperous and equitable future in diverse and inclusive societies with economies that increase wealth, but not, this is so important, not undermining our food, clean air, living circumstances, with climate and biodiversity that's safeguarded so that it's not just about us, it's about who's coming after us. It's about the future generations. And so how do we bring this perspective into our research as a methodology? Throughout this presentation, I'd like you, to the extent that you feel comfortable and want to enter your thoughts into the chat as I use terms so that you can be relating it to your own experience and your own understandings, and maybe asking for clarification about some of the things that I talk about. And so periodically throughout this presentation, I'll present you with some questions. And if you want to enter some thoughts, ideas, responses, questions into chat, Ida will gracefully and gratefully share those with me so that I can have a better understanding of who's out there, who I'm talking to, how I can be responsive to you. So if you could think about this, what do you understand the term transformation to mean in your research projects? And what are your thoughts on how research can contribute to transformative change? So if you could just, let that sort of meander around in your mind and think about that. And Ida, if you see something coming through on chat, and just let me know what that is so that I could maybe be responsive to that.
Okay, I'm checking the comment and I don't see any come up. Probably people still start to follow your lecture.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay. And I do apologize because I don't know your language, and I could give the lecture in English, Spanish, or American Sign Language, but none of that would be responsive to your context. So I'm just going with English and hoping that we do have effective communication. So why do I say we need to use this transformative lens for research? Because we are facing great challenges. And my argument is that we need to frame our research in a way that looks at those underlying assumptions that guide our methodological choices, and that we prioritize an ethical stance of inclusion and challenging oppressive structures. That we design our research in ways that we have an entry process into the community that's designed to build trust and make goals and strategies transparent. And that throughout the process of conducting the research, we disseminate the findings in ways that encourage the use of the results to enhance that social, environmental, and economic justice and human rights. And that we also address intersectionality with culturally responsive, feminist, critical race, equity-focused, and indigenous theories that are relevant within the research context. And Ida mentioned that we had published one article in the Journal of Transformative Research on some work that she was doing, and I was able to participate in a very minor way when I was a visiting professor at the University of Flinders, and then with their relationship with UNPAD, able to come to West Java and to witness some of the community engagement in which the social, environmental, and economic justice theme was very salient. Particularly thinking about the farmers who were trying to have a product that they could create that would allow them to create additional employment opportunities, that would protect the environment, that would keep the young people in the rural areas, that they would have jobs that would be meaningful. and not to engage in farming practices that would be destructive to the environment. And so that was that nexus of social, environmental, and economic justice that really came home for me in working with Ida on that project. So I'm asking you now to think about what are the principles that you use when you begin to design your research. Are you thinking about this ethical stance of inclusion and challenging oppressive structures? Because we know that what gets implemented as interventions have uh, have an element of power of who gets to make those decisions about what is needed and how it's going to be implemented and how the data are going to be used. And so we want to think about that in the design of our work as an ethical practice. That if I'm going to do ethical work, I need to figure out who needs to be included and how I can include them in ways that's not token, but allows for authentic engagement to address the structures that continue oppression. And through that, looking at those entry processes, how do I get into a community? Who do I engage with? Do I deliberately go out and engage in a personal way so that I can build that trust? And I know now under the COVID restrictions, I'm not really very well acquainted with what's going on in West Java or Indonesia broadly, but in the United States, we're still pretty much in lockdown. Those areas that have opened up have seen a resurgence of cases, and unless unless Americans start to be more caring about their neighbors, we're going to continue to see this disaster. So how do we do that? Is there a way for us to use technology that's accessible to the populations that we want to reach? Just like here today, where you have over 100 people who have come together virtually without fear of infection because we're being respectful of each other. So how can we do that in a way that still allows us to build community and have collaborations and coalitions? And then thinking from the very beginning, how can we disseminate? What are the strategies that we have? And I'm going to touch on these methodologically as we move through this presentation. And then intersectionality really is about what's relevant within this context. I noticed that you've had a number of presentations on violence against women and girls, and that the human trafficking issue was one that was raised by the governor's wife when I was able to visit with her in West Java, in Bandung, and that under that context, then gender becomes very important. But women exist in multiple dimensions. And so, what are those other characteristics that we need to be aware of to appropriately include people? So, just thinking about that. Ida, have we had any responses in chat yet?
Um, no, there is a question on what is intersectionality? Does it refer to the mixed method? Um,
Okay. In this particular context, intersectionality means that we don't just look at gender, but we look at gender and religion and skin color and economic status and presence of disabilities. And we look at what is important there in terms of understanding better, because if we treat all women the same, we're not going to be addressing the needs of those who are most at risk, who are most marginalized, most oppressed. So does that make it clearer?
yeah, I think that's clear enough. And there is a
Okay.
response from Paris, and he said that in his point of view, uh, uh, as much as we focus on SDGs principle, transformative research is more required. So he thinks that in the context of sustainable development goals principles, transformative research is required. That's
What is required?
The transformative research will be needed
Yes.
to address the issue of sustainable development goals.
Okay, yes, we're in complete agreement with that. Because I think business as usual is simply not going to get us there. We need to put this lens to the methods that we use. Otherwise, we might be introducing interventions that are going to maybe benefit the rich, but not the poor, that are going to cause harm and not benefit. And so this lens is asking us to be more critical and more reflective, and the use of data to be sure that we're being responsive to the issues that are arising within the communities that we work with. So here's a question is, which type of methodology do you use the most? Where are you more trained towards quantitative side, qualitative side, or mixed methods? And in my history, I was raised and taught to be quantitative. But as soon as I started working in high poverty areas, I realized that the numbers weren't giving me the full story. And so I started learning about qualitative, and that was a very important part of my methodological training. And then because I did mostly community-based work, it seemed just natural to put the quantitative and qualitative together. But in a methodological sense, the schools that teach methodology often prioritize one over the other. And so this concept of mixing methods is one that we need to understand how to do it, the rationale for doing it, the rigor that's involved in doing it, so that it is a defensible methodological choice. Okay, so when I talk about mixed methods, I said I wasn't going to get into a lot of this in terms of the real elementary stuff, but I wanted to at least know that we're talking about the same thing when we talk about mixed methods. And so the definition that I use is one that was developed with the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, also one that I have elaborated on in a number of the books that I've written. That it does involve the collection and analysis of qualitative and quantitative data, but that's not sufficient. You also need to integrate that data at various levels and stages throughout the study, and I'm going to show you a design of a study that does have different levels and different stages, so you can see in practice what I mean. And that it might be a single study or it might be a sequence of studies where you do this bit, then you use that to carry on to do more. That it's very methodologically eclectic, meaning that if you've been trained in experimental design or survey research or phenomenology or any other naturalistic ways of collecting data, that all of those can be brought to bear. The participatory action research, community-based participation, all of those can be brought into a mixed methods design. But the really important part is this synergy between the quantitative and qualitative aspects of the study, meaning that you get something bigger and better and more with more depth and more understanding because you put the quantitative and qualitative data together. So it gives you a richer understanding than if you only looked at the quantitative data, only looked at the qualitative, or looked at them separately. But putting them together, integrating them, and benefiting from the increased understanding. So that's really the argument for the use of mixed methods, is to get that synergy, to get a better understanding by putting those data together. Okay, so I would like to know sort of where you place yourself in terms of the concepts of paradigms and assumptions that guide us in our methodologies. Are you an expert on the topic? Are you well versed in this topic? Do you have an acquaintance with the topic, or is this a foreign concept to you? So, Ida, do we have any more in the chat at this point?
There is someone saying that Sahruddin Lubis doing mostly qualitative research, and also there is a question from Dr. Budi Gunawan. Actually, he was with us in the conference last time, in the symposium, and he's asking what is the difference between transformative research, action research, and participatory action research.
Okay, so excuse me. The thing about transformative research is that it adheres to certain principles, which I'm going to show you in just 1 minute, within the framing of paradigms and assumptions, that action research and participatory action research can be conducted in a transformative way. It can also be conducted in a non-transformative way. If I only go to elites and I ask them what's the problem, what should we do about it, and I follow only the dictates of the elites and share the results, then we're not being responsive to those people who are most marginalized. So you can bring this transformative lens to action research, to participatory research, but you can also use those methodologies without being transformative. So let me get into more detail about what I mean. So when I talk about the research assumptions, what I'm talking about is what do we consider to be ethical research? What's our understanding of the nature of reality? What do we accept as valid knowledge, the source of valid knowledge, and the relationship between ourselves and the people that we are working with in the study? I call them stakeholders because they have a stake in the outcome of the study. And methodologically, then, where does that lead us? So let's look specifically at the transformative assumptions, which I think will then add greater clarity to the question that was just asked. So if we think about, well, what makes an ethical study? In the United States, we have these institutional review boards, and they have certain criteria that say you must protect the participants in the study, you must have confidentiality, you can't be overly burdensome, and things of that nature. But that only takes us so far. And I think if we are actually saying, I want to work towards transformation, that it's very important that we look at ethics in a deeper way. That we say, in order to be ethical, we need to be respectful of the cultures that we're working within. And you notice that I said multiple cultures because it's not homogeneous across West Java, across Indonesia, certainly not homogeneous in the United States. If you're working, for example, in a medical community, there's a culture for that medical community, but there's also the cultures of the people who come in to be served by that medical community. And so how do we know what those are? How do we know how to be responsive? And that's what we want to put into the design of the study. How do we design our studies so that they are positioned to promote that social, environmental, and economic justice and human rights by design, so that it's not just something that's a lofty goal, but who do we need to engage with so that we increase the probability that the results are going to be an increase in justice, and that we address the inequities that are holding people back. That we include reciprocity. What do we give back to the communities? Do we give back to them in a way that once our research project is finished, that they now have capabilities and data and information that they can use to sustain that transformation? That again has to be built into the study, that we recognize the resilience within the communities. So what are the strengths in the communities? When we look at people who are living in communities where, for example, they don't have clean water and they don't have adequate housing, they don't have access to healthy foods, and yet they're surviving, they have a resilience, a strength. And so how do we bring that into the study? We need to recognize that interconnectedness, and that's where also it reinforces the idea of the social, environmental, and economic justice, that it's not just me as a living human being right now, but it's me living in this environment with the mountains, with the ocean, with the forests, with the jungles, with the rainforests, and it's me, my future generations that come after me that I need to be aware of. And so building those relationships is what constitutes an ethical practice in a transformative study. And when we look at ontology, or the nature of reality, we say, well, it's multifaceted. There's different opinions about what is real. Those opinions about what is real come from different social positionalities. But which one we choose to act upon has very real consequences, and that this is historically situated. So, for example, in West Java, in Bandung, the notion that that your economic development should be made through textile factories that pollute your rivers, that the version of reality that a textile factory is a good solution to an economic problem is one that's made by people who have power, but the consequences of accepting that is that that river is polluted and that people drink from that and they use that water for their bathing and they get sick. And so if we were to engage with the community about what makes sense in terms of economic development, it would most likely be something that didn't make them sick. And so that's really what we're talking about, is how do we uncover whose version of reality is being used as a basis of decision making, and what are the consequences of accepting one version of reality over another. And in order to do that, we need to build those relationships. So epistemologically, we need to be interactive, we need to build trust, and this notion of coalition building is something that I started to understand better in Indonesia, and now in the United States, more and more of these coalitions are surfacing, are being developed in order to address really difficult and long-standing problems such as poverty, such as abuse of people who are harvesting the crops in the United States, such as health disparities. And so I'm going to give you some examples of those as we move through this. So methodologically, where does that take us? To the use of this transformative lens, to a dialogic stance so that we are interacting, to development of methodologies that are responsive to the complexity of the culture that we're working within, to the use of mixed methods, and the inclusion of policy change as a part of the design in the methodology, because we know that things are going to change if we can get policy change. And if we're aware of that as we begin the study, it takes us to the point of, well, who do we need to engage with? How do we need to engage with them? And how can we sustain that engagement across the life of the study? Okay, so I have chosen as an example the reduction of health disparities, and asking the question, how does the transformative lens open up our understanding of health disparities? So let me give you just a little context from the United States. And with this COVID-19 pandemic, we are seeing very, very visible the health disparities based on the race, ethnicity, and color of people's skin. So what we see is a disproportionate number of people who are Black, people who are Hispanic or Latino, and people who are Native American, Indigenous, being exposed to catching COVID and dying from it. How do we explain that? It's not because they're doing something wrong. It's because we live in a society with systemic racism that does not provide access to adequate health care, housing, etc., that's needed to keep people safe. So how does a transformative lens help us to understand that? Well, if we were to listen to only health experts who make their decisions based on, well, if people would just make better choices, and what you see in the picture is eating right and exercise and education. So why don't people just eat right and exercise, and then they'd be healthier? But if we look from a transformative lens, we see these versions of reality that need to be addressed in order to address those health disparities. It's not sufficient just to show people who live in poverty the food pyramid and say you should eat from this level and minimize that level. Because number one, they may not have the money that's necessary to purchase the more healthy food. They may not have the sustainable employment. They may be working at jobs, particularly now, with very high rates of unemployment that are not providing them with sufficient funds to have the quality of life that's necessary to be healthy, that it's limiting educational attainment. Our schools are closed. We will have virtual education when the school system starts again this September. But my son is a teacher, and he tells me that it can be effective, but most of the students who actually actively participate in online instruction are more of the students who were doing well anyway, and that's the students whose parents are the essential workers who have to go to their jobs, are not home to monitor the children to make sure that they get online and that they do all the things that the teachers are asking them to do. And so the expectation is that this educational gap is going to get wider. They also don't have access to markets and grocery stores, clean water, healthy food, safe places to exercise. And the stress that's associated with lower socioeconomic status and systemic discrimination is well documented. The health risks increase when you live with a higher level of stress. The residential segregation and the pollution, the toxins that people are forced to live around because of the poverty, because they are segregated in terms of access to housing. And then the access to affordable health care and to culturally responsive health care. To health care that people say, yes, I feel very welcomed and supported when I come in to work with those health providers. And so we see that there are many issues that need to be addressed when we look through a transformative lens, rather than just saying, well, why don't they just eat right and exercise? And so that, I hope, gives you a picture of what it means to bring a transformative lens to try to better understand the complexity. Okay, and then in terms of ethics, how do we build our understanding of how to be respectful in terms of the various cultures that are operating? How do we build relationships that are viewed as being trustworthy? How do we design it so that it does address that nexus of social, economic, and environmental justice and addresses inequities and includes reciprocity and recognizes the resilience and brings that into the study? What kind of relationship do we have with our stakeholders? If we operated under a post-positivist paradigm, we would be saying, no, we shouldn't get involved with, we should be neutral, we should be objective. But that could be viewed as just working from our own cultural frame without understanding the frame of those who are experiencing marginalization. And that would sustain oppression. So if we're using a transformative lens, we're looking at a design that's more interactive, that's more culturally responsive, that recognizes the heterogeneity within communities, that allows us to develop trust, and that includes this building of coalitions, which I said I would talk about again. And it says there, Fight for 15. This is a coalition that was built for people who do the fast food work in the United States, like McDonald's and Wendy's and, I don't know, Burger King. I think you have some of those that have shown up in Indonesia. And the people who work in those fast food restaurants were working under very oppressive conditions. They would enter with a wage that was far below $15 an hour, which might sound like a lot in West Java, I'm not sure. But in the United States, it's not enough really to sustain a household, to pay your rent, to have food and pay for all those other things in life. And so there was a labor union that thought maybe we can organize people, but the fast food workers weren't joining that labor union. And so the labor union said, well, the most important thing is not that they join the union, but that they have a living wage. And so they partnered with a community-based organization. It started in New York City. And that community-based organization went around to all of the people who are working in these fast food restaurants and talked to them, what are the conditions, trying to get a better understanding of what was going on. And the fast food workers themselves then came together and said, you know what we want to do? We want to go out on strike. We want to have a strike that's very visible. And so if you know something about New York City, you may have heard of Madison Square Garden. It's a very big landmark in New York. And there's a Wendy's that's located right there. And so those workers said, let's strike the Wendy's at Madison Square Garden. And in New York, you also have a huge media presence. And so the media came, and they were on the news, on television, they were on Facebook, they were streaming on YouTube, they were doing all of the different social medias, and the newspapers and the politicians saw it, and the politicians said, really, we should do more to support these workers. And so several states in the United States have now passed laws saying that fast food workers need to make a minimum of $15 an hour. So this particular coalition was not a part of a research project, but to me, it represented something that maybe we ignore too much in the research designs, that maybe we should be thinking about how do we partner with organizations that can take forward the message of change in a way that politicians will pay attention to it. Okay, so when I get to design, what am I talking about? Beginning with building relationships and using these relationships as a basis for a more complete analysis of the context so that we come to understand better what's going on here, and that we come up with interventions that can be pilot tested, and that we use the data from the pilot test to revise the intervention until it's something that really looks like this is working. It's really helping us reach the goals that we have. And then using that as a basis for the development of an intervention that can be implemented more widely where more data can be collected about the implementation, and then looking at the impact on a broader scale and the use of that information for transformative purposes. Now, the fact that this looks linear is really deceptive because we need to work on those relationships throughout. We also have to be aware of any changes in the context. We need to look at how many times do we need to do this pilot testing? Maybe it's an ongoing process, and maybe we never get to something that's static that says this is the successful way to do things. And this use for transformative purposes should be throughout the entire phase. Okay, so if we put this into a mixed methods design, let's look at this particular one as 6 stages. There's nothing sacred about 6 stages. You could do it in 3, you could do it in 5, you might need 8, but this gives you the idea of how you can flow from building relationships, doing your literature review, consulting with individuals, consulting with groups. Who do we need to engage with? The development of those relationships and coalitions, and figuring out how to work together, developing those working strategies, because we can't assume that we just know how to work together. We need to look at how do we work together. And this usually is the key to having a successful project, is that you figure out how to work together and you critically access the quality of that as you move through the project. And the conduct of contextual analysis to just understand better what's the history here. What's happened here? You can use a lot of different methods there. Focus groups, surveys, extant data. If you have data that's already being collected for other reasons, the waste products, the quality of water, things that's already being collected, use that data to understand better. Literature, the GIS mapping, if that's appropriate, to understand what's going on in this community. Using that data then to identify the various value positions. Who's holding on to which values? Who thinks that this is the direction we should be going? What's the basis for that? And use that as a basis for the development of a pilot intervention that you then test in the 3rd stage, the pilot intervention. And you can use multiple data collection methods, but it should be very intensive so that you use more of your qualitative observations, interviews, maybe photo voice, where you have people take pictures of what's working or not working, where they feel safe, where they don't feel safe. Focus groups, surveys, using the pre and post data collection you plan to use on a wider scale to test it out. All of this is testing it out, and team meetings so that you're talking about what's going on here and using those opportunities to talk as a data collection event. Then implementing on a larger scale if it's warranted. And you can use similar data collection as for the pilot, but you would add a lot more about the process of implementation. If you're implementing on a wider scale, you need to understand what's going on. Are people able to implement? Are resources in place for them to be able to do this? Is there a will to do the things? Because sometimes it's more attitudinal or value-based why things don't get implemented. And then also being aware of what are the unexpected outcomes, positive and negative. Are good things happening we didn't anticipate? Are bad things happening that we didn't anticipate? And looking at the effectiveness in the next stage, the post-data collection. And you can collect the same kind of data as you did pre-testing, post-testing, but you can also look at things like, how does this stack up with the UN's indicators for these sustainable development goals? Is it appropriate to use things like artwork or poetry or photos or mapping, and looking at the quality of the relationship? So it goes back to phase 1. How are we doing working together with each other? And then the use for transformative purposes, building in the opportunity for use for policy change, to refine the intervention, and to improve and expand on those relationships. I have an example of a transformative mixed methods design study. And this one was conducted in Canada, where researchers were concerned because of the violence in immigrant communities and that they had come to the conclusion that the nature of violence and hence the need for an intervention was different than in the mainstream society. And so they said, well, we need to begin by building relationships. Who do we need to include? So they said, let's develop a team that includes community members, so the immigrants that come to the program to be served, and the agency staff, and let's figure out how to work together. And when they had their working strategies, then they did a very in-depth, this is one of the most in-depth contextual analyses I've seen, is when they looked at the social context, epidemiology in terms of the rate of violence, behavior and environmental assessment, what's the housing situation, do people have safe places that they can go, an educational assessment, and a policy assessment. How is policy supporting the reduction of violence, or is it sustaining the oppressive status quo? From that, then, they developed an intervention, and they had a separate phase for the development of the intervention, during which they built the capacity of the people to provide the services. They developed more culturally and linguistically relevant information. So looking at who those immigrant communities are, what's culturally and linguistically appropriate for them, and providing more opportunities for discussion about family violence with the immigrant communities. And then their next phase was a pilot intervention and a process evaluation. So they implemented it. They had monthly discussions that they synthesized. They used focus groups, and they provided opportunities across all of the stakeholders to share their experiences of success or challenges. And then their use for transformative purposes was looking at the impact and the outcomes. Did this change the rate of violence, the type of violence, the response to violence? Documenting strategies that were building cohesiveness and trust. So going back to that team building. And this is something that they hadn't done before because the policy didn't ask them to do it, was to begin tracking family violence cases by the justice system, differentiated by cultural group. And so we see here how they started with the relationships and moved through with the development of something that was more culturally responsive and linguistically responsive, and gave them a more accurate picture of what was going on in the communities. Now, I'm a member of the American Evaluation Association, and as a member, I get to get the new directions in evaluation, and one of the very newest ones is called Evaluating Community Coalitions and Collaboratives. And I've been very excited about this. It is available online through various university libraries and so forth. And so if your library doesn't get it, maybe you want to get it on interlibrary loan or ask them for it or something. But it really gives a better description of how we go through this relationship building by identifying those existing community action groups and understanding the history of their efforts. What's been going on in this community? So I don't come in as a researcher and think, I have to reinvent all this. And then looking at who are the formal leaders, the informal leaders, the potential leaders, maybe people who haven't been in a leadership position because they haven't had the opportunity, but is there a way to find them and to identify them and train them to build their capacity to be leaders that are needed? What are the community needs and gaps, and what are the community strengths and opportunities, so that resilience in the community, understanding that target population, their needs and their assets to improve, build, and secure the project credibility. So a lot of times we need to be sure that this is something that community buys into, that they think this is something. When the farmers were told you should make strawberry wine, they were like, what? We don't, no, we don't drink wine. Strawberry wine, what are you talking about? Maybe you could teach us how to make strawberry jam, because that's something that we all like, and we may be able to do it for export and have more economic development. So that you could then create that momentum for the project activities by getting the community input. Okay, so I just want you to think about this. If you want to contribute in chat, think about the research projects that you're doing. Who are those major stakeholders, and what do you think you know about their norms and beliefs? I mean, we all have a cultural lens we bring in with us, even if we've been trained to be critical, self-critical about what we have as a lens. How can we use mixed methods so that we don't allow our lens to be the one that dominates, but we come to understand better the norms and beliefs that are operating in the community, how to culturally engage appropriately, how to bring in the expertise and knowledge and strengths of the community, and then how we can build that into the design of the studies that we're doing. And so if we talk about a transformative lens in the building of coalitions, we could say, well, who gets to set the coalition agenda? Is it the most powerful person? Is it the researcher? Is there a way to make it more equitable, to bring the voices of the people who are experiencing the problem, who have experience on the ground? Who do we engage? How are they engaged? What evidence is there that the coalitions include members of the marginalized community in culturally respectful ways? How are power differences addressed? Recognizing that there are power differences. How do we make sure there's not one dominant voice? How do we connect the program outcomes with the functioning of that collaborative or that coalition? So certain research methods have been used. They've used key informant interviews, surveys, focus groups, program tracking, observation of meetings, document reviews. They've facilitated community discussions with community visioning exercises. They've used relational mapping to assess the strength of connections between various parts of the project, collaboratively developing quantitative assessments, social network analysis, looking at the membership and leadership rosters, who's on the list, who's coming to the meetings, and then developing rubrics that actually are designed to assess equity and justice. So these are some of the methods that have traditionally been used to determine the effectiveness of coalitions. If we go back to looking at this and saying, well, where are we? We've been talking about building coalitions, building relationships. We've been talking about the contextual analysis and how important it is, and then having interventions that can be developed based on those findings and using the findings for transformation. So when we talk about contextual analysis, what is it that we want to include? The cultural groups. What are the cultural groups? What are the norms and beliefs that are operating there? Historically, what's happened? Have people been on the land and then sold the land and moved into the cities, and now they're abroad working and sending money back? Is that what the history of the economics is in that community? We need to understand that. Politically, who's in power? What are the policies that are relevant within this particular context? How do you address issues of corruption within the government? It's a very touchy issue, a very sensitive issue, but one that if we totally ignore it, we won't make progress. Legislatively, what's in place? What needs to change? What are the power structures? How do we critically assess those power structures so that they buy into the need for the kind of changes the community says that they need? These are things that are just immensely important. They're very challenging. And in order for us to be able to work towards transformative change through the use of mixed methods, we need to design that using quantitative and qualitative methods to assess the context. All right, something's happened because it's no longer going through. Let me see. I may have to go. What? Okay, sorry. Okay. So, can you still see my screen? Can you still see my screen, Ida?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay. Let me move this down then. Okay. All right. So when I talk about the utilization for transformative purposes, and I know we're sort of coming to a close here to start some questions, we're looking at the value of sharing information throughout the course of the research so that we emphasize facilitating mid-course corrections. We don't stay doing something that's not working well. We plan for that utilization in the initial design. The topic of the study has to be one that the participants say, yes, we think data should be gathered on that. And we think if we get data on that and disseminate it, it will help us move towards the goals of social change and social justice. And that we deliberately include policy makers and advocates so that they can continue the work for social change once the research study is complete. Okay, so we know some of the traditional ways that we do reporting. We do written formats. We have to ask ourselves critical questions when we write things, whose voice is included, whose voice is privileged. We can also use the data in interactive settings and community-based settings through focus groups, through interviews, through visual presentations, drawing pictures, using photos, videos, slideshows. Ethnodrama is something that I found to be very effective to stimulate, to catalyze change, taking the data and presenting it in a dramatic form with an audience of people from the community, stopping the action and saying, well, what are you thinking? And the community themselves then taking up the challenge and saying, we think we need to address this issue. We could move forward doing these things. Obviously, web-based is something that we're all looking at now and how we can use it more creatively, and community meetings, community-based. It's difficult with COVID right now, but I would want you to think about this. Who would you include in the preparation and dissemination of findings? And how would you be sure that you include members of the community in that process? What challenges might you encounter? And how would you deal with power differences when you're involved in those activities? What's your thinking about the ownership of the data, and how would you handle that? Is there a way for ownership to be multiple so that members of the community can be using that data? You might need it for academic purposes, for publication, but is it presented in a way the community, the policymakers, can continue to use it? What aspect of the transformative paradigm is most salient at this point? How would you include constructive action for improved relationships, coalitions, interventions, and policy? So what are we looking for? We're looking for interventions that are culturally responsive and transformative. We need to change what we're doing in terms of interventions. So reaching a conclusion that the use of transformative mixed methods will help us raise different kinds of questions, maybe new kinds of questions, that will lead to innovations to address the complexity of the wicked problems, the intransigent problems, the problems that we just don't seem to be able to solve. Not going to solve them with the same old thing. It needs creative, transformative thinking. That this focusing on relationship building with policymakers and members of the communities are things that are going to be the key towards transformative change. And it cautions us also to consider how to support that constructive change, but still avoid introducing additional harm. What's it take to do this kind of work? It takes courage, because you're stepping outside the box to do things methodologically that maybe not in the textbooks. I mean, they're in my books, but not all textbooks. That you're using mixed methods to capture the complexity, to address the issues of justice and ethics, the use of teams, researchers, and coalitions, and building capacities within communities. So when Ida introduced me, she said that I have several best-selling methodology books, and I do. I've just dedicated my life to understanding how we can use this type of methodology to create the kind of change that's needed to have a more just world. There's some other resources, and I understand that this webinar will be available. So if you want to check up on any of these other resources about culturally responsive or indigenous, feminist, disability, LGBTQ, multicultural, there's some resources that are available to you there. And then I do have some homework for you. I want you to think about what will you do differently as a result of having participated in this session? Because I came here with the firm belief, as Eleanor Roosevelt taught me, that it takes all of us working together to make change. So you have my email address there. I give it to you because I do believe it takes all of us working together to create the research that's needed to support transformative change. If you're doing this kind of work, you encounter challenges. I hope that you will share it with me and you will get back with me. Okay, that is the end of the presentation. And so now, Ida, I am happy to entertain questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Donna. This is a very interesting, brief session of your lectures. It will take a while to read the whole of your books, but you have very good insight from your talk in just about 45 minutes. Thank you very much for that. And there are some questions from the participants. I think we addressed some questions before, but I will read some questions from the participants. Um, from Sri, she's asking about what is actually the advantage of using transformative research.
Okay. The use of transformative research is designed to explicitly address those structures that are preventing advances in terms of social, economic, and environmental justice. And by the use of this lens, what we're attempting to do is to engage with the appropriate people who have a stake in the findings of the study, who are being impacted by the problem, or who are in positions of power to fund or provide services, to take a look at those structures that are preventing the increase in justice. And that decisions that get made are critically analyzed with that lens. So as the example of the farmers said, oh yeah, no mixed strawberry wine, that was somebody's idea, but it didn't really work out for the farmers. And the farmers are the ones who are living in the rural communities and experiencing their young people leaving because there's not job opportunities, who need to find a way to use the crops that they can grow, that they know they can grow, to increase job opportunities and to increase the economic value without destruction of the environment. And so with the use of this lens, it raises those kinds of questions that might not be asked if somebody said, you know, we just want to know if there's an economic improvement because now we've dug a new mine or we have built a textile factory. Are people making more money? But before you make a decision like that, the transformative lens would say, look at the broader context. What are the implications in terms of environmental, economic, and social justice?
Okay, you can take a rest and have a drink. All right, Donna. And then there's another question from a practitioner. He is working for a company in East Borneo, and he's working for a CSR program. And he's normally using the combination of quantitative and qualitative baseline data for CSR program. But he's saying that normally there are so many complexities and problems uh, in the community group, and sometimes he's also facing difficulty which one to address. So what kind of methods actually is the best to use to determine and to establish the program comprehensively?
Mm, mm. Yes. Well, there's no simple answer to that, as I'm sure the person who asked the question knows. But I think it is important that the different viewpoints be identified and that they be shared in a context where people can have civil discourse about addressing this problem versus that problem, or using this strategy versus that strategy to address the problem. And that then those viewpoints can be shared across groups that may have very different points of view. This is a strategy that's being tried in the United States, and I know we have a long ways to go. If you are aware of the police violence that's been occurring against people of color, the police have one point of view, and members of the community have various other points of view of how to solve that problem. And in order to move forward with it, we need to be able to gather systematic data about each of those constituencies' different points of view and share them, maybe not in one group, because the people may not be able to have civil discourse in one large group. It may be necessary that it's done in segmented groups so that the police get a better understanding of what the experience is in the communities of color, and that the people who are operating as police officers can share the challenges that they face, in hopes that by this shared understanding, a pathway forward can be found. It's not easy, it's complicated, it's an ongoing process, but it's critically important to try to manage that understanding of how each group sees the world, their version of reality. And if we can reach that point, then we can start to collect data on the consequences of accepting one version of reality over another in terms of a pathway forward.
Okay, great. Thank you, Donna. I think you addressed most of that question. And then we are moving to the question from Rimbo. He's asking, what does it mean if we say cultural respect? Is it similar to what we call cultural relativity? If so, then what is our standpoint in judging what we must or must not do in transformative research?
Okay, I am not 100% clear on what cultural relativity means to the person who asked the question, but to me, it would imply that different cultures hold different beliefs, and that all beliefs should be treated equally. And cultural, in the transformative lens, I would argue that we need to critically assess what those cultural beliefs are. So if one cultural belief is that it's okay to beat your wife, to be abusive towards women, I would say that the consequences of accepting that is a violation of the rights of women. And so I would say that critical lens has to be brought to that belief and say, how do we shift the cultural beliefs about what is appropriate in terms of how we interact with women? And I have seen women in Pakistan holding protest signs saying that abuse of women is not part of our culture. So looking at who's most hurt when a cultural belief is allowed to stand uncritically, I think, is the transformative lens of looking at culture. And rather than saying all versions are equal, we look at the consequences of cultural beliefs, which ones can move us towards a more just society, and which ones will sustain oppression.
Okay, thank you very much. And are you ready for the next question? Or you need to drink?
Yeah.
Okay. This is another question from Paramita Rahayu. She's a lecturer from Diponegoro University. So this is from Central Java. So we have some participants from almost different part of Indonesia. And Paramita asking, what is the strength of mixed method over qualitative method in terms of achieving transformative effect to the community? So
Mm,
what
mm,
is the strength of the mixed method?
mm-hmm. Well, I really believe in the value of qualitative methods. They give us a richer picture, more complex understanding that I think is very difficult to achieve with strictly quantitative. On the other hand, quantitative allows us to show change on dimensions that we consider to be very important. If we didn't have quantitative measures, for example, on rates of abuse or educational attainment or economic achievements or on reduction of poverty, we would be unable to demonstrate that what we're doing is having the effects in a quantitative way. And with some of the people that we interact with, that quantitative data is going to speak louder than the qualitative data. So that's also a part of understanding the cultures in which we work, that we need to be responsive in terms of the types of data that we collect so that we can provide data that is compelling and persuasive, that says this is the right direction or we're going in the wrong direction, this is the harm that's occurring. And the use of both quantitative and qualitative allows us to make a stronger argument.
Okay, thank you, Rena. And also, there is a question from Mudiati. She's watching you from YouTube, and she's asking question on how to overcome our assessment bias as a researchers in transformative research point of view.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the things that we've talked about are really that avenue that's going to allow us to understand better what are our biases, what beliefs are we bringing into this situation, what are the values that we hold, and then how do we gather data that allows us to see that we need to shift our understanding, that we make the assumption that we're there to learn, not there to impose our own belief systems. And so an attitude of humility, that I can learn and that the knowledge that people bring from all levels has value. It's not just the academic knowledge that I got at the university, valuable as it is. I mean, I was professor for more than 30 years. Obviously, I saw value in that. But the things that the deaf community taught me were things that I couldn't have learned from my textbooks or from my professors. And so I think it's that engagement, which was really the overall theme of the presentation today, that puts us in a position to challenge the biases that we bring with us. And if we're accepting and critical and reflective then we can adjust to be more responsive to that context.
Okay, thank you, Donna. And there's another question from one of my students. He's from Afghanistan. He's asking the research transformative whether we can use transformative research approach in terms of policy change, because most of the time the policy implementation are not really implemented well. So he's asking, especially in the case of women representation in bureaucracy and women leadership in public service.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in Afghanistan, I understand that the cultural issues are very complex around that topic. The engagement of women in any kind of public policy arena is one that is very complicated and needs to have a clear historical understanding. And I think finding people, not just women, but men as well, who can engage in that conversation, in that dialogue around how do we bring this change in so that it's a meaningful change, so that if women are brought into policy-making positions and to political positions, that they are actually the ones who are able to have their voices heard, rather than having a place that they hold, but their voices are not the ones that are being used as a basis. So it's being very thoughtful about who you bring together and looking for, maybe it's a community-based organization, maybe it's a religious-based organization that will be supportive of the inclusion of women in meaningful ways in government and policy, and that might be the avenue that helps you to move forward.
Okay, thank you, Donna. And there is another question from our alumni. She's a lecturer of from Banten province, another province, and she's asking how could we use the contextual analysis for public administration issues?
Hmm.
Mhm.
Well, I think she's probably in a better position to answer that question herself.
Mhm.
But I would say with public administration issues, it's critically important to understand the history. What's the history of the public administration issue? What kind of legislation has been on the books past when? What were the problems with that legislation? Were there revisions that were needed to be made? Are there issues that are still outstanding that haven't been addressed by that? Are there constituencies that have been left out of that? Um, I'm just thinking, like in the 13th Amendment in the United States, it says that everybody should have the right to vote except people who are in prisons. And, and it's like, okay, so that's part of our Constitution. But what it allows for is the disenfranchisement of a big portion of our population. And so if I were going to address a public policy, I would want to trace that back to figure out, where did that come from? What's the justification for that? What are the avenues that we have for modification for that? I mean, that's one, because it's in our Constitution, it's even harder to change than a law, than a policy, than a regulation. But it, it, I have to understand the history of it. Where did it come from? And why is it there? And how could we build around the power structure enough impetus to get that changed? So I think, if you just sit there and think to yourself, well, what are the issues? Where did they come from? What's the history of this? Who's been involved in it? Who's had the power to determine what these issues are and how we address them? Then that takes you down the road of the contextual analysis.
Okay. Thank you. We still have so many questions. I don't know if we still have some time. Would you like to answer some more questions?
Why don't we plan to stop after the next question?
Okay.
One more question.
Okay, next question. I have to pick because we still have about 8 questions. Hang on. uh, okay. I think I'd like to check another one because some of the questions are a bit similar. Uh, okay, I think I will read the question from my colleagues from the Faculty of Medical Doctor, and he's a public health specialist, and he's asking about how actually transformative lens seeking to establish more than just intervention that can reduce disparity. Therefore, justice is one of the ultimate goal. Do you think globally we have a serious problem today in our worldview, so that we tend to produce knowledge that not really beneficial for community, instead doing harm to them? Yeah.
Okay. The question asks about a very important point, and that is our framing of how we do research one that actually will contribute to justice, or is one that sustains the status quo or actually increases harm? And I think we're all aware of the literature about international development and the money that gets poured into countries, and that we don't see the change that we're hoping for. We saw that with the set of goals that preceded the SDGs. There was some progress made on some of the goals, but the lack of progress, particularly with women and people with disabilities, was very visible. The lack of attention to environmental issues under the SDGs predecessor was very visible. And so I think what we're coming to is a point in time where we do need to shift that lens to say, how do we deliberately design our research so that we do not continue to do the same thing? I made up a saying in my own personal life, and I find it to be very helpful, is to quit hitting your head against the wall when you can see the writing on the wall. If you see the writing on the wall, meaning this is telling you that this is not working, then stop doing it. And take a step back and say, what is it that's going to require us to do to be a part of the solution instead of just going along the same track? And so that's really the heart of what I want to say, and what I want to leave you with is we need to be more expansive in our understandings, to use strategies that are more inclusive, to understand the complexities and the multiple cultures that are operating, to explicitly address power that allows oppression to continue, so that we can make that progress. Am I optimistic about it? I actually am. I'm optimistic because if I was pessimistic, I would just be paralyzed. I wouldn't have a reason to get out of bed in the morning. How could I get up every day and think, well, nothing we do is going to make any difference? But if I get up in the morning and think, maybe some little nugget, something that I do, some data that I collect, some interaction that I have is going to push us forward towards a more just world, then I'm going to work on how to do that. And I'm glad that you're all with us on that journey.
Okay, Donna, thank you very much for the material as well as the answer for the participants' questions. I'm really sorry for those who asking questions, and because of the time limitation, we are unable to answer all of the questions, because this is very interesting session tonight. This is actually a bit late here. This is 9:14 p.m. here, Donna, but people still with us. So thank you very much for being with us. And I noticed there are some of my other colleagues from other faculties, including communication and medical doctors and other and also other institutions, not only from UNPAD but also from other our network from outside university. So thank you very much, Donna. This is very interesting session of your lecture tonight. So hopefully this inspires all of us that actually we can do more than just traditional research. We can make change together, and transformative research could be a good answer for us uh, to to make even though only a little bit change for a better future. Thank you very much again, Donna, and I will. And I think everyone are very happy with you here because everyone's saying thank you very much for you, especially for us, Donna. Thank you for keep supporting our center, and we will keep working together in the future. And the
Yes.
team say thank you very much for your active engagement with us. So everyone, we are really sorry that we couldn't address all of the remaining questions, but please feel free to communicate with Professor Donna as she shared her PowerPoint presentation as well as her email. And you also can read most of her books that actually available to purchase online. And I think she also read some articles, journal articles. You also can access them. So you can find most of her publication. If you Google her name, you can find. You can surprisingly see how productive she is, and hopefully tonight is only the start for us to talk to discuss about transformative research method, but actually probably some of us have already done this kind of thing at the community, and I hope this lecture can make you stronger. Okay,
Yes.
thank you so much, Dana, and thank you everyone for being with us. Hopefully we can see you next time in the future.
Yes, thank you very much, Ida, and everyone there at UNPAD and all the people who stuck with us through this late night. My website is transformativeresearchandevaluation.com. So it's pretty easy to remember, I think, transformativeresearchandevaluation.com. And I have a lot of things posted there that are accessible that you can read. If you want to follow up with me, please do so, because I know it takes all of us.
Okay, thank you very much. And Donna Budi is here as well. I hope you say
Yeah. So nice to see you.
Yes.
So nice to see
Okay.
you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. And, good morning. You still have one day to go, but it's very late for us. Okay.
Yes.
Uh,
Okay. Bye,
yeah.
kitty.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. He's also listening. He's also listening to you.
A very smart cat, huh?
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you very much. Terima kasih semuanya. Uh, dalam waktu dekat ini kami juga akan ada lagi webinar series. Sorry, don't I have to speak in Indonesian language
No,
to
no, no. I'm
announce
going.
next webinar.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay, bye-bye,
keep in
Donna.
touch. I will post all of the information on the UNPAD, visit UNPAD website, as well as our center website, and I also will share it in my personal social media. Thank you very much. And I noticed some of my old friends, Pak Wawan, kumaha damang. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for everyone. Hatur nuhun, tos wengi wilujeng istirahat. Nuhun Pak BG, Pak Dr. Rian, Pak Irfan, punten pisan. Tetiasa diwalar pertanyaan kasadayana. Kapunten waktosna